politics. I have a show called Happy Ending on Fusion right now. And when Gimlet sort of approved this project, they reached out to me. As the producer who pitched it remembered me from my soccer days. So they brought me on to just do this podcast.
Okay, that's awesome. Damn.
Yeah.
So, where did you grow up? Did you grow up in
Miami, Florida?
Okay, all right.
Yeah, my parents are from Spain.
Okay.
So they met in Miami, and I was born and raised there.
So is soccer kind of in the blood then? Is that?
Oh yeah.
I mean, I was trying to, to prep for this and everything. So I was watching the show and, listening to some of the stuff you've done. And it's pretty clear that you are, I guess, a rabid soccer fan. Would that be a safe assessment? Okay. All right. So I got to quiz you. So I guess the last 5 World Cup champions, who have they been?
Oh, well, Germany, Spain, Italy, Brazil, France, Brazil again, Germany, West Germany, Argentina, Italy, Argentina again, Germany, West Germany, Brazil, England, Brazil again. Brazil.
Dude, that's awesome. As soon as Brian gets on, we'll go. I know I'm just going to take your time. Actually,
I'm hearing an echo. I don't know if it's something that I'm doing wrong with my mic or.
So it's probably it has something to do with Zencaster. So have you ever used that before? Have you ever used Zencaster at all?
No.
So it's actually it's Chengerized one. I don't know if Gimlet uses it or what, but so it basically allows you to have a conversation with each other in real time. But each one of our computers is actually recording our audio individually, and so if it sounds like sometimes I'll cut out or Brian will cut out, and you get a little worried, but it actually works more effectively and efficiently because our audio is always good on our individual computers. And so what happens is once we're done with our conversation and I hang up, your computer will export. Hey, there's Brian right there. Okay. Your computer will send the audio to the cloud, and I'll just download it from there.
Right. Hey.
So, Brian, can you hear us?
Yeah.
No, I don't think he's.
Do I need to?
No, you're good.
Do I need to press anything on the Zencaster to press record, or is it automatically doing it?
You're good. I'm the one that's going to hit record as soon as Brian gets in here.
Cool.
So here's the plan then. We'll do just kind of initial introductions. You can talk a little bit about yourself. I thought maybe at the beginning would be a good time to just talk about the podcast and what you guys are thinking about in terms of long term. I know you've done several shows. I'm sure you probably recorded a ton already, but it's a fantastic idea, and I think it's interesting that Gimlet took on a sports podcast. So we can talk about that, and then I definitely want to get your take on politics and Trump. We are very much liberal professors, and so we jive a lot with what you're saying.
Pointy-headed academic.
What's that? Pointy-headed professors? Yeah. Hold on.
Typical.
For sure, man. That's us.
Yeah.
Let me get let's see, Brian. No, there you are. Okay. Brian, can you hear us? Brian, can you hear us?
He just stepped away. I'm watching him.
Okay. There he is. Okay. Hey, buddy, you ready?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Here we go. All right, gents, I'm going to hit record, okay? 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's installment of Sports Nerds, your favorite 2 professors, obviously talking about sports. Brian, I was thinking this week we should make it our tagline as ruining sports for people who like sports and making sports more enjoyable for people who hate sports. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that it's the beauty of it is its simplicity.
Yeah, right. That's not a long tagline whatsoever.
Yeah. No,
today
that's a mouthful.
Well, I'm not going to leave any President Trump jokes. I'll leave those jokes.
Too early, too soon.
Yeah, too soon. Today, Brian and I are very fortunate to be joined by Nando Vila. I guess, Nando, you're most famous probably for your Fusion show, correct? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, famous, I think is probably a stretch, but yeah.
Okay.
That anyone knows me.
Yes. So I guess, we brought you on the show because you're getting ready to launch this podcast next week, correct? You want to just tell us what's happening, what dates we need to tune in, how we can find your podcast? Or did it cut out?
Fifth. It's called We Came to Win. It's about World Cup history. We do kind of little audio documentaries about famous moments in the World Cup. So, for example, England's 1990 World Cup run, which really kind of captured the imagination of the English public and really helped turn English soccer around. It was really in the dumps after a really difficult decade in the 80s for English soccer. They had they had Hillsborough and Heysel and all that stuff, and really the game had gone way downhill. And then the 1990 World Cup kind of really turned it around and led to the Premier League and led to all the great stuff that we know today about English soccer. We're doing an episode on Maradona's incredible run in World Cups. He had a little bit of everything in his World Cup career, including probably the most famous World Cup game of all time in the quarterfinal against England in 1986. We're doing a story on how the U.S. qualified for the 1990 World Cup. It's actually a really fun story. They hadn't qualified for the World Cup in 40 years, and they were given the World Cup in 1994. So they really wanted to qualify for the 1991 because they didn't want to be seen as just being able to play in the tournament when they hosted, because the host gets in automatically. And then the way they did it is actually it's kind of like a classic Disney story of like a ragtag group of guys get together and overcome insurmountable odds. We have a story about Cup in Zaire game in the 1974 World Cup against Brazil. A very strange free kick incident. It actually has a lot more behind the wrath of a dictator. So your podcast or Stitcher or whatever it is, it's called We Came to Win.
So why did you, I guess, Brian, I mean, you could jump in here because you know a hell of a lot more about soccer than I do. I grew up on a farm.
I'm clearly second in this conversation. I'm like, I want to hear these stories right now.
I know.
Spoils the podcast.
So I mean, I guess why does Gimlet get on board with this now? Like, what kind of pitch did you have to make to Gimlet? And folks, if you've never listened to a Gimlet podcast, they do great work. But like, what did you have to say to them to get this thing on air?
Well, actually, they approached me once the show was already pitched and approved. They approached me because I used to host a soccer show on Fusion called The Soccer Gods. But yeah, I mean, this is a World Cup year, and the World Cup is the biggest sporting event in the world. Bigger than the Olympics, bigger than the Super Bowl. Interest in soccer just skyrockets whenever there's a World Cup. I mean, everyone gets into it. There's nothing quite like it. So I think that they saw it as a good opportunity to sort of capitalize on that, and also get into sports for the first time ever. And I think it's kind of wise for them to get into soccer because, sports coverage in America is very saturated with NFL and all that other stuff. It's really hard to sort of come in with something original and fresh. But with soccer, there's kind of like, it's still a little bit of virgin territory. There's still a lot of ground to be done in. So, it's just like a good opportunity for them to try in sports podcasting.
Okay, there's sorry to interrupt there, Sam. There's definitely been an upward trend, I think, in soccer in the U.S. It seems to have caught on in a lot of younger, bigger cities where you see, U.S. wannabe soccer hooligans traveling around and beating drums and waving flags and scarves and all of that stuff, which I personally think is awesome. I grew up on soccer. We've talked about this a bunch on the podcast, though, that people tend to think that sort of sports popularity has been static over time, which is not true, right? You don't have to go back in American history very long at all to see when boxing was huge, bigger than football, when horse racing was bigger than football. I wonder if kind of what you're talking about maybe points toward a trend in the rise in soccer. And I have kind of a second question if you wanted to comment on. You don't have to at all. I wonder if you think that's true. Do you think that the MLS or the NWSL is doing the right thing for the sport by bringing in all of these players from European leagues? I'm a Manchester United guy. We bring Ibrahimovic, leaves Manchester United and goes to the MLS. I sort of tried to stir the turd on Twitter. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on radio, but by sort of calling out the MLS and saying, listen, this is not the way to grow the sport. Like the U.S. not qualifying for this year's World Cup is in no small part due to this commitment to older players as opposed to seeing if we can develop younger talent. So I don't know. I would love to see soccer become, bigger than football. It's more safe. I think the game's more fun to watch. But do you think we're kind of playing our cards right to make that happen?
I mean, I think that you're touching on something that's correct in that youth soccer development in the United States has a ton of problems, and it has a ton of disadvantages, especially the countries in. So, Bayern Munich, whatever, they all have their own youth development program. They must be like I mean. It really ready to youth development is really run by colleges. The club teams don't really do a lot of that. And colleges are just like, bless their heart, but like a Boston College or whatever is never going to be as good at developing young players as Bayern Munich is.
Yeah.
Right. So there's the U.S. has to really think about how they sort of do that youth development thing. I know it's a huge issue whenever there's talk about the future of U.S. soccer. It's just how do you sort of take all this this untapped potential that exists in the U.S. Right? It's a massive country. That could really, if it really got its act together, could really do it. But I think that you're right in general. That I mean, it's fun to see these guys come in, and some of them come in and take it really seriously and play well and stuff. Like I mean, I think Nando Vila at NYCFC has shown that he's bought into it. He kind of plays well. A lot of them just come and just kind of do their thing and don't really take it seriously, and it's just kind of like a 1 month story where the novelty kind of fades after a while. But I will say that like MLS has done probably in general, I would say if you look at it big picture, has done better than I probably anticipated like 10, 15 years ago when it was just like kind of a joke, like now you're seeing, the stadiums are full. There's real enthusiasm and there's a real kind of fan base there. I've been to some of these like big MLS cities like Portland or Seattle and stuff like that. And it really is really cool to see like a city getting behind a soccer team, like a local soccer team. And I think that seems like a new thing to me. It wasn't like that when I was growing up here in the States. But yeah, I mean, I do think that you're right that there is a big jump in terms of soccer fandom in the United States. I mean, I don't think you can discount the video.
That's a good point.
Yeah, good call. I'm sorry, we're cutting out a little bit. There we go. Shoot. You can continue, Nando. We can hear you a little bit.
Yeah.
Yep, I can hear you now. Yep, you're good. Now it's cutting out again. Darn.
I might have to.
Now it's good. I mean, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's okay. I can cut all this out. There we go.
All right, cool.
There we go. Okay.
There you go.
Okay, let's. This is actually a good spot just for a quick break, so that way we can kind of run. We'll jump back in and do our next segment. So let's just give it a 2-second pause. All right, Nando, I had a question for you, kind of knowing, obviously, that you talk about soccer as a much larger cultural phenomenon. How much do you think that this country's kind of inability to accept soccer or to celebrate it at a mass scale has to do with, I don't want to say kind of latent racism or anything like that, but certainly kind of a nationalism that likes to set Americanism above the rest of the world? Do you see that kind of playing out in how we treat that sport differently in this country?
Oh, 100%. I mean, in sports, Americans need to be the best, right? I mean, it's the world always makes fun of things like the World Series or whatever, where like, it's funny they call it the World Series, and it's it's really a national trophy. No one else.
There's two Canadian teams.
There's two Canadian teams, but baseball is played all over the world, right? I mean, there's there's a bunch of great players in Japan and in the Dominican Republic and other places, but the World Series is the American competition, right? So there is, and America is a sort of hyper nationalistic country that really sort of likes to flex its muscle around the world in any arena, right? So to see a soccer team really struggle and really get beat by countries that we quote unquote deem inferior is definitely. Has definitely been hindered the sport's popularity here. I think especially with maybe like the older generations, especially like in the context of people that grew up like in the Cold War and stuff like that kind of thing is like really important. I think with younger people, it's probably less important than it was. The sort of rah-rah Americanism around the world is not as, I don't know. It just doesn't seem to resonate as much with younger people than it does for people of a certain age. But yeah, I think you're 100% correct in that assessment.
Well, considering that we're going to have the first World Cup with Donald Trump as president, like, can we? I guess I don't know what to expect. Not in terms of kind of coverage of it. I think it's probably going to be the same as we've been accustomed to. With obviously just cable coverage and all of that, but do you think that it may slip into the kind of mainstream political discourse in ways that it has in the past, or because the U.S. is simply not going to be playing this year, are we going to expect the World Cup to just be avoided as a cultural phenomenon?
Well, I think that the thing that's going to be kind of nauseating, right, is that it's in Russia, right? So there's going to be a lot of like. You know what I mean? I don't know. So there's going to be that aspect to it. But I mean, it would be totally different if the U.S. were in it. I mean, God knows what Trump would tweet about it. I mean, you could see him like tweeting about like a bad call, that went against the U.S. or something, which would be so bizarre to imagine. But yeah, or I mean, it's unclear. I think what's going to happen. I mean, who knows if there'll be some sort of big, racism controversy in the World Cup. You can never discount that in Russian soccer. It happens a lot. In
Are you expecting that? Are we just expecting that though? Because I mean, there was that story that I sent you guys last night about Russian fans, just chanting racist things. Are we there? Now
it happens all the time. Yes, it happens all the time in the Russian league. I mean, I remember a Brazilian player named Hulk played a long time for Zenit St. Petersburg, and he was saying like, "Oh my God, it's like, it happens all the time." It is true that in World Cup matches, especially with games that don't involve Russia, a lot of the crowd just isn't. They're from people from all over the world, right? So it doesn't really matter, but I do think I wouldn't be surprised if something happened. If there was like a racist chanting incident, it wouldn't be out of bounds, which would then be a huge story here. And I think that you might see some people sort of like you might see it sort of being enveloped in the broader culture war, right? Because everything is the culture war now.
And I kind of forgot about this until you just mentioned it, but there was a thing at the Euros 2 years ago, right? Where there was a fight between England fans and Russian fans. And I'm not sure if there was a race question at the center of that, but did a bunch of Russian fans get expelled? And there was the discussion of kicking out the Russian team from the Euros, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's been a slight return into the fan violence that we used to see a lot more in the 80s, right? Mm-hmm. There's been some high profile incidents in Spain. There was a guy died actually outside of a Spanish league match this year I think it was Russian fans. And then there was a very high-profile incident with some French ultra fans that where someone died as well. And yeah, you're right that the English fans have always had that reputation. There's always been a slight hooligan element to them. They travel and they go in, they go in groups, and they like to get a little drunk when they're in a city that is not theirs, and they sort of get loud and start singing, and then other people maybe are walking by, and then these things happen. So you've seen a return of that a little bit in recent years. So yeah, that's another element that could happen in this World Cup for sure.
Man, obviously it has tended to go hand in hand with the sport, but really any sport. I think that's the issue with hooliganism and the coverage that it tends to get, especially in the United States, is these stories like this that will circulate in our media, in our sports media in particular. And then there's just a desire to kind of forget that the same kind of shit happens at Dodgers Giants games, right? A few years back, where that guy was thrown in the hospital. This stuff happens at college football games all the time. But again, I think it's this othering of soccer in the same way that mainstream American politics tends to other, right? What did Trump call it? Shithole countries, right? I just don't want it to be leveraged that way, I suppose, this summer. And I think our environment may be primed for that.
This is sort of a veer off course a little bit, but there was a movie, a fictional movie that was about soccer hooligan culture in Great Britain. It was called Green Street Hooligans.
Yeah, Elijah Wood.
That movie. That movie sort of tries to make this argument that there's an ethic to being a hooligan, right? That you can go get in fights, but you only do it with other hooligans, and it should never rise to the level of extreme bodily harm. Everyone should be able to go to work the next day. There's this really romantic version of just really sort of supporting your team. I don't know if any of that is true, but I expect that's not the stuff that we're dealing with in the examples that you mentioned before.
It's objectively true that people have gone to the hospital, people have died as well. Yeah. So sometimes the good, clean fun of just beating the crap out of each other on a Sunday outside the stadium can escalate into something worse.
Sure.
And the sort of soccer is interesting in that there's it's a mass sport. There's the mass fandom, right? But then there's also they tend to have these sort of radical elements, what we call ultra fans, right? That are sort of organized supporters groups, and it's kind of been an interesting phenomenon that doesn't quite exist here in the U.S. They often have, certainly in Spain and in other places, they often have sort of neo-Nazi leanings and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. They sort of double as these fringe political organizations. So it's in Europe, especially the sort of links between soccer and politics are much more explicit than they are here, where here they're kind of just below the surface, right? You don't see it's not fans of the Steelers are left wing, and then the fans of the Eagles are right wing. You don't see organized supporters groups like that here ever with sort of political elements to it. But in Europe you often do, and it has to do with the historical roots of wherever the fan base comes from, and so they can be often quite interesting. But yeah, they often spill over into very unpleasant violence.
Yeah. Are we moving towards sports being recognized as not just a spectacle, but as something that has political significance in the way that you see other countries around the world? I think bring up the Kaepernick case, right, and kneeling in the NFL over the last 2 years. I think Brian and I have made the argument that so much of the disdain for what is happening is not necessarily racism. Obviously that's a part of it, but it's just leave our sports alone. These are supposed to be those places for us to escape. Are we going to just inevitably have this interconnection of sports and politics that will kind of, I guess, define that relationship moving forward? Are we moving towards that, I guess?
It's certainly becoming more explicit, right? But this idea that sports was always kind of independent of politics is somewhat maybe misleading, even in the United States. The U.S. military has been a major sponsor of the NFL for a long time. They use it as a pretty useful propaganda tool, to sort of promote American military power and public support for U.S. Armed forces, right? You fly. I mean, it's the typical thing. You're flying jets over a stadium. I mean, that's something that like shocks Europeans all the time. Like what? So it's kind of strange if you think about it. So like you could never really divorce it. It was just kind of bubbling under the surface, right? It was just where we played out a lot of our political frustrations or something in that arena. But now it's just become more explicit, right? It's the Kaepernick thing really, I think, took the mask off, but was a highly politicized thing, and even in something like for example, like for years, it wasn't seen as political, but like in college football, this idea of not paying the players, like that's a political question, right? Whether you like it or not, and it's why you see people so passionate about it, like why does a common fan, why would they care if the players are getting paid or not, right? But it's because they sort of sense deep down that there's something political underneath that, so yeah, I mean, I think that that it's becoming much more explicit now, and I don't know if it's good or bad. I'm not sure that there's like a value judgment to it, but it's definitely changing. And I think the Kaepernick thing was a big factor in changing that.
All right, we'll take a quick break. We'll be back to continue talking about this.
Cool.
All right, so I guess
Sam, can I interrupt before we jump?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can we go back to what you were just talking about, the idea of paying players? I was sort of not to be creepy, but combing your social media, sort of getting getting a lay of the land, and I saw that you had tweeted that, right? At one point,
your shirt's
had
off?
a link to an article. Yeah, exactly. We're on video, right? That you had posted an article, and then you were like, "Pay the players" was sort of the tagline, and it made me think. This morning I was listening to the podcast called The Daily, which is an NPR or a New York Times daily podcast, and it was an interview with the cheerleader who got fired from the New Orleans Saints, and sort of a really interesting sort of look into this cheerleader culture, and sort of all these rules that are different from team to team, but basically, these cheerleaders are paid minimum wage or maybe less. They've got all these weird rules and expectations and that sort of stuff. And I learned from this interview that her kind of lawsuit against the Saints just alleges that it's discriminatory to have different rules for the players and cheerleaders. Like, it's not against the rules for the players to follow the cheerleaders on Twitter or to, go up and talk to them, but it is against the rules for the cheerleaders to do that back. And we've talked about the pay for play for college athletes thing a lot, but this got me thinking, sort of listening to that podcast and seeing your tweet, like it's interesting that there's not a broader discussion about compensation inside of sports as kind of an industry, right? Yeah. So not to say this is certainly not me suggesting that college athletes are getting a fair deal or interesting or anything, but I do think it's interesting which issues tend to get highlighted, because I see this cheerleader thing as sort of getting swept under the rug.
Oh, totally. I mean, one of the strange things about sports fandom in general, and I think it's particularly pronounced in the United States, is that sports has a tendency to get regular people, working people, whatever, to side with management on contentious issues, right? Because they identify management as their team, right? On issues where in any other kind of industry, like whether, they would be like, oh, those asshole bosses are really just kind of exploiting, these poor, they'll just frequently side with management. The teams are owned by, billionaires and they'll always side with them or most of the time. Right. It's a strange thing how that plays out. Like, and you see it time and again on these issues of compensation, like you say, or on these issues of, fairness or, whether like a cheerleader is trying to, get players not to grope them, things like that. Like, they'll always just side with the team. Like, it really has it's a useful way to get people to sort of fall in line, right? So yeah, I mean, you see that a lot.
Okay, you guys hear me? Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
cut out again.
We lose you for a sec.
No. This is this is just it's quite frustrating to me, I guess, to be having this kind of conversation. But let me ask you, since you're kind of in the middle of it, we talk a lot about how media is changing our sports kind of consumption. how are you seeing it change, not just your profession, but what do you expect the major changes to be for just televised soccer, for consuming soccer across the globe? Are our changes that we're seeing here in the United States different than what other countries are experiencing? I mean, is it going to add to the popularity of the sport? I guess, what is your prediction, to kind of put you on the spot?
Yeah, I think that there's I think that the NBC deal with the Premier League was, I thought, a huge moment in U.S. soccer fan culture. It was the first time that you really got the Premier League, the most popular league in the world, packaged around sort of the kind of coverage that you're used to seeing the NFL get, or the NBA, or whatever, one of the big leagues, like, just all out, wall to wall kind of 24 hours coverage of the most popular soccer league in the world. So you definitely are seeing that. I think that the sort of the popularity of the game worldwide, people here are starting to realize it, and the more it's on TV, I think it creates like a virtuous feedback loop. And I mean, this is something that women's soccer advocates talk about a lot. They say that, like, the most watched soccer game in the history of America was the 2015 Women's World Cup final, right? It wasn't a men's game, and they're like, oh, look, there's evidence that there is sort of an untapped interest here. If there were more coverage and if there were more broadcasting of it, there would be more popularity. So I do think that the more the sport gets shown here, and the more that there's media about it, it creates a positive feedback loop. It is true that sports media and soccer media are also undergoing the same negative pressures that other kinds of media are seeing, especially with the collapse of advertiser-based media, right? That's just as true in sports as it is anywhere else, right? You're seeing and as well the struggles of ESPN as people sort of cut the cord and stuff like that. The sports leagues are becoming more and more expensive, but people are paying for media a lot less. So I think you're going to see a similar thing. I think you're going to see across sports a sort of trend toward the leagues probably distributing their own content, and sort of the death of the sort of independent media middleman. To put ESPN as an example, that's a little sad in a way, because I do think that the independent as they can be, because how independent could they be, if they also own the rights. But it is definitely a nice thing to have that. But yeah, I mean, I think that the more soccer gets shown on TV, the better the coverage gets, the more popular it'll be here.
Yeah. So I want to sorry, Brian, I want to unpack that real quick, because you have, again, been behind, you've been in the producing studio, you've been behind the camera. Is it becoming cheaper now for these leagues to actually, again, stream their own content? Like, to me, there was the bulkiness of the equipment, but also the team that you had to have in order to kind of produce this kind of stuff. So you foresee perhaps something like the NFL or even the Premier League being able to stream their own content for a relatively cheap kind of number?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I think if you kind of look a little bit outside the box and you look at something like the WWE, for example, they've been really successful in creating their own kind of subscription model where you could become like a sort of paying WWE member, and you get access to like all kinds of historical matches, and they do all kinds of content that's original for them, and it's produced by them, and it's it's for their fans. Like, you can imagine if you're like a diehard English Premier League fan, signing up to some sort of English Premier League package that gets you the games, but also gets you access to like old games and and like review shows, and also because they're sitting on all this library, right? They own all this historical content, which is very valuable. That's currently being basically like underused. And yeah, it is getting easier for anyone to produce this kind of stuff. You're right that it used to require all kinds of crazy equipment, and it's still quite expensive, but these leagues are just making so much money that you can foresee them just sort of cutting out the middleman, because if there is a middleman, it's because they're making a profit, right? And if they could just sort of have that for themselves and sell ads themselves, and you can imagine a world in which they can sort of distribute that on their own via streaming. Because the other thing that the TV broadcaster used to have as well, outside of the production capabilities, was the distribution network. Right? They had the license to broadcast, and then they had the cable channels, and the leagues didn't have their own cable channels. Now you're starting to see more and more the leagues have their own cable channels, but eventually, it'll just all be streaming. When that happens, I just don't see why they would want to go through someone else where they can't control it. Like in this which they can control the content, they can control the advertising sales, they can charge all kinds of fees that they want or not, in different packages, and you could just see it being very, very profitable for them, and just cutting out the media middleman.
Well, it seems really feasible too, because, and Brian, I know you have questions, and I want to make one more comment here. Like, this is Major League Baseball was doing this 15, 20 years ago, right? They had the infrastructure to basically stream their games online, and they created the infrastructure that a lot of other leagues have taken from. And so it seems very, very possible that people will just return to that. And I think Major League Baseball just got rid of it because it was too expensive. But as you had pointed out, these leagues are worth so much money. I guess I wonder if it also narrows the sports consumption funnel to where now I only pay to watch Euro soccer, and I don't want to pay to watch Major League Baseball or football. I just wonder what the kind of ramifications of that could be. And I'm just thinking too. Yeah.
No, I think go ahead.
No, I was going to say, that's one part of it is that the models will probably shift, right? Then the games that Facebook is streaming for Major League Baseball are interesting because they're not selling ad space for commercials like every other baseball game in the country. Instead, you're seeing ads because you're on Facebook, and they don't leave the game between innings. They do interviews and that sort of stuff. The second thing that I think is worth sort of noting is the idea that as we get more content, right, as sports entertainment or entertainment more generally becomes more democratized, right? We go from just broadcast TV to broadcast TV plus cable, just those two things, plus internet streaming, plus YouTube and Periscope, et cetera. It's not just enough to have access at that point because people have too many choices. It then does circle back to what's the narrative that makes those things interesting. A good example of this is college basketball regular season is not that hard to access, but nobody watches it, or relatively speaking, fewer people watch it because there's not interesting narratives about it. But the script flips when we get to March, right? So I think you're right that the access barrier is, one side of the coin, but the other one is, can we get people interested? And that's happening in seemingly more organic ways.
Well, I think that what you point out when as media gets more democratized, there's like a weird phenomenon in which there's this sort of like winner takes all dynamic, and we're seeing that with the NFL, right? In a way, like the NFL has swallowed the other sports in America. Like 20, 30 years ago, it wasn't clear that the NFL was the dominant king of all sports in America. Now it's the undisputed king. It's the most watched broadcast on TV. It's the most, by far, like it's not even close. And like, turn on ESPN, during NBA playoffs, during NFL off season, and the coverage, NFL is like getting at least as much time as the NBA playoffs. And it's like pure speculation about like who's going where, and injuries and stuff like that, and stuff that shouldn't be as interesting, but because there is sort of this winner take all. You're seeing a similar thing in movies, right, where there's kind of like a winner takes all dynamic. Instead of like having a bunch of kind of middle tier movies, you have a small number of huge movies, and then like a lot more very tiny ones. And you're seeing the same thing in music, right? The streaming thing in music, you would think kind of would open it up to anyone to access anything, but we're seeing is that there are much fewer big pop stars than there were in the past. They're just swallowing up everything, like most of the market share, and then the little guys are just getting like little crumbs, right? If you look at the top streaming on Spotify, it's dominated by the top 5 or 6 artists, like it's by like an insane degree. And then there isn't this kind of middle class that used to exist, and then there's like a bunch of guys, a bunch of acts that have like, a very small number of streams. So I think you probably could see a similar dynamic in sports where instead of like, people are fans of like 4 or 5 different sports and they kind of watch all of them equally, that one sport kind of takes all. And we're seeing that a little bit with the NFL.
No, all right, we got a question. Brian, this is not from. No, this is people are actually watching. So from Mike Polk, he wants to know if college soccer got more coverage, it became more, I guess, competitive and fun to watch. Do you think that would bleed into the rising popularity of professional soccer in the United States, or is that a possibility? Or are we expecting something? Do we need something different?
Yeah, I mean it's a tough one. I don't know what I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, the college soccer that I've watched. I mean, I went to Boston College. At the time, the team was number 1 in the nation. We had Charlie Davies, who ended up being the starting center forward for the U.S. national team. We had Alex Bedoya, who's on the U.S. national team still, like on the same team. It was really good. But you watch those games, and you're like, the level is just it's not as and it has to do with everything, like from the way the college system is set up to the level of the coaches. That they're just not. Like, you're just never going to get top-class coaches to go coach college soccer in the United States. Like, it's just not – they would rather coach 13-year-olds at Bayern Munich, right? That's, like, a much better job. It's true. Yeah. So it has just some structural challenges to make the sport more interesting. So yeah, I don't really know the answer to that. I wish I had a better answer to it.
Yeah, I wonder though if college could address that problem, if they could attract higher level coaches, or if they could concentrate talent differently. Would that mean that we would have players like Christian Pulisic, instead of leaving the United States at 17 or whatever and going to live, and he's playing in the Bundesliga somewhere, right, by himself? Maybe he would instead say, "Oh, I can go to college and get that same level of development." I mean, is it a little bit of the problem that we don't have that many players that, and maybe poached isn't the right word, but they leave and they play, European soccer because it's objectively better.
Yeah, I mean, you're just never. I mean, how is the University of Wisconsin going to compete with a club that has a professional team attached to it? Mm-hmm. There is a pipeline to the pros, right? In a way that is much more direct. And then you're competing with those guys. I mean, because what happens is, like, the Borussia Dortmund B team, right, for example, which probably, they have their own kind of reserve league or whatever. And they often will train with the A team. Like they'll scrimmage together. They use guys from the B team if they need to fill out the squad for training sessions or whatever. So like for a guy like Pulisic to be able to play at 16, 17 years old with guys who are competing in the Champions League, that kind of in practice experience is something that you could never replicate in a college system, right? I mean, in the other sports in America, like in football and basketball, because those leagues are so dominant already, that it is already the highest level. They love having this sort of like semi-professional development system that they don't have to pay for. That is the college system, right? But they don't have to compete against anyone else, right? Mm-hmm. They have that sort of monopoly power over that sort of development system. They don't have to worry about doing it themselves. But in soccer, because it's open and because you're competing with the world, and the world already has a huge head start, you're just putting yourself at a huge disadvantage. I mean, I think that what the United States tries to do is they try to do it through the national team, which isn't a bad idea. To sort of find the best players from around the country, put them through a national system, early on, and it's not the worst idea in the world, but it's hard to implement, and they just haven't really totally gotten it right yet. They haven't hired the right people to run it, but yeah, the college system is just tough because I don't see how they can compete with the big clubs, even a Brazilian club, even the Flamengo development system in Rio de Janeiro already has like a huge head start,
Is there any weirdness about that in Europe or anywhere else in the world? That I know that players get sort of inked to deals with teams when they're really, really young, right? Not professional contracts, but they will go play for the Everton U15 team. Like Rooney signed for them when he was in high school or something, or maybe even junior high, right? I mean, is that because this does put? I mean, you're pointing at a big cultural difference, which is there's the people in the United States sort of, or the U.S. seems to enforce this go to college kind of culture, and the place where you see this come to a head is basketball, right? So you're right, college is a good minor league or junior league for the NFL. But it seems like college basketball is not that for the NBA, that you have all these players that are professional ready when they're 16, 17, 18 years old who structurally can't go. So that tension seems to be on display here. And maybe that's the difference. It's not, are the players good enough or...
And listen, the European system creates all kinds of other problems, right? That there's all kinds of shady stuff that goes down with very young players, like shady agents who like sign them and from around the world, from very poor neighborhoods, in Africa or in South America, and then bring them to Europe, but they kind of scam them, and the clubs kind of look the other way. Oftentimes, there's been Atletico Madrid and Barcelona had got banned from signing players for 2 transfer windows. I don't know if you guys remember this story that came out last year. 2 transfer windows, they couldn't sign players because of irregularities in their in the signing of like 15, 14, 16-year-olds, right? So there's a lot of room for exploitation from very shady interests in that system. I mean, the college system in that way, which we assume is like really dirty, right? I mean, I think at this point everyone assumes that there's like all kinds of. It pales in comparison with the kind of stuff that goes on with these kind of third-party agents that sign up young players who have who wouldn't know any better.
Yeah, it happens in baseball.
We have the same issues here, though, too. Yeah, exactly. Baseball, Brian and I, we're on the same. Like this.
Yeah, that's the same thing. It happens like in the Dominican Republic and stuff like that. Yes, and the professional teams turn the other way. Like they look the other way.
I don't think they turn the other way. I think they embrace it because they say it's legal, right? Like we'll just have a facility and scouts who are in whatever the Dominican Republic or all over Latin America, Central America, and their job is to go out and find talent. And at least what I've heard is the under the table deal is, hey, look, I'm going to sign you and I'm going to create a pathway for you to maybe go to the United States and play baseball. But whatever signing bonus you get, I get that money, or I get half of that money or whatever. And apparently it's just sort of like, yeah, I guess if that's what I have to do. I mean, there's more money at the end of the rainbow for people who make it, so they're willing to do that deal. And it's I don't think Major League Baseball teams really even try and deny this. I think they're just like, yeah, that's sort of how it happens. Yeah. So I mean, that's pretty similar, right? That's dirty.
So we've come to a conclusion that we're all just taking advantage of children. I think that's we all just agree there. Those who can.
Hey, but listen, sports are awesome, though. I mean, if that's what it takes, no.
We still love them, right? It's crazy, like we know all this stuff, but yet we still tune in to watch every Sunday.
That's what Sam meant by a podcast that's making you hate sports. We're like, talk about this stuff, and I'm like, but go watch golf this weekend or whatever.
We're so emotionally connected to sports, though. I mean, we're just so into them. They just blind us to what's really going on. And it's like the three of us who are relatively smart people who are having this conversation, like even us, right? We have an issue kind of looking past, we're just laughing it off as if it's not, people's lives aren't ruined in the Dominican Republic or in Ukraine or something. That's what's nuts. But I guess that's why we write stuff, maybe. So we'll just keep doing podcasts. All right, Nando, thank you so much. Do you want to make one more pitch now that the audio is working for the show?
Yeah, absolutely. Tune in to We Came to Win on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get podcasts. Drops April 25th, a week from today, with 3 episodes. 3 episodes all at once.
Awesome.
We'll share them.
Thank you, dude. Yeah, we will share them. Thank you, Nando. Appreciate it.
Guys,
take care.
Easy.
All right, dude. Sorry about the sound there at the beginning, man.
No, not that. No worries. I think there was a problem with my computer at one point.
Okay. Well, it ended up working. The last 35 minutes was great.
Yeah. Sometimes, even though the sound is weird between us on the VoIP, it actually records your track on your computer. So sometimes it won't even matter at the end. It's kind of a crapshoot, but yeah.
Cool.
Okay. All right, well, it looks like we're good. Thanks, Nando. Take care, man. Bye. Hey, Brian.
What's up, man?
Let's see. That's
we gotta get on the phone with this other dude.
Yeah, we do. I guess he's gonna call up.
What fashion sense?
I don't know what they want to talk about. I have no idea.
You want me to lie and say I wear suits or something? That dude's cool.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah,
I can't find him on Twitter.
It's just Nando R Villa, VILO. Yeah, all the audios actually are. Vila. Yeah.
I was just watching his Facebook shit. He's a smart cat. I mean, went to BC.
Yeah.
I could have talked.
I feel bad for how shitty it was at the beginning.
Yeah, there was good follow-up questions to be had in there based on the things I think he was saying. He was talking about I think he was talking about the video game, the soccer video game.
Yes.
Are we recording this are we broadcasting this on Facebook Live right now?
No, I